Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Rebecca Markert, the legal director here at FFRF, and I'm here in the Stephen Ewell Friendly Atheist studio at our headquarters here in Freethought Hall in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mark Dann, Director of Governmental Affairs based in Washington, D.C. On today's show, we're going to talk about how right-wing judges are being put on the defensive by one of FFRF's key allies, Demand Justice. Demand Justice has been called by Fox News as the most active group advocating for expanding the Supreme Court. FFRF actively lobbies with Demand Justice to expand the Supreme Court and lower courts, make the courts more transparent, and support comprehensive ethics and recusal reforms for the Supreme Court justices. We work closely with Demand Justice on the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights Fair Courts Task Force, which supports pro-civil rights judges. FFRF is also the newest member of the Unrig the Courts Coalition, which Demand Justice is also a member. Our guest today is Katie O'Connor, who is the Deputy Chief Counsel at Demand Justice. Katie helps to direct the Demand Justice's advocacy programs. She can be found on Twitter at Katie O'Connor-esque, and welcome, Katie.
Thank you. So glad to be here. Thank you both, and thanks to all the audience for making some time on this Wednesday morning.
So if you have questions for Katie or for us, you can ask them in the Facebook comments below or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. So this show is called Ask an Atheist, but today we also have a question for you, our viewer. What do you think FFRF and Demand Justice should be doing together to reform the courts? You can put your questions in the comments below and we may read them on air.
And please remember, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization and cannot engage in political campaigns, meaning we can't endorse candidates, parties, or their platforms. Any such view expressed here today is not endorsed by FFRF. So, Katie, let's talk a little bit about today's judicial climate. Fox News said that Demand Justice is the most active group advocating for expanding the Supreme Court. Senator Ted Cruz thinks some of Demand Justice's actions are shameful, and Mitch McConnell thinks a lot of your tactics are aggressive. Why does the Demand Justice raise the blood pressure of so many on the right?
So I think that it's mostly because, packing the courts with conservative justices has been a project of the conservative legal movement and the conservative movement more broadly for a long time, decades. And it's been their most successful one. So now we have a 6-3 supermajority on the Supreme Court that is, proudly conservative. 30% of circuit court judges are now Trump appointees, and 54% of circuit court judges are Republican appointees. And part of the reason that Republicans have gotten this success, the conservative legal movement has gotten this success, is because they've been so aggressive. So it's a little ironic to hear, especially Senator McConnell, saying that our tactics are aggressive. But what we've seen over the past, decade, especially, is starting in 2016, we saw President Obama nominate Merrick Garland for a Supreme Court vacancy that occurred when Scalia died. That vacancy was held open largely by Senator McConnell himself for over a year, just so that President Trump could fill it with Neil Gorsuch when he got into office. We saw it again 2 years later when Justice Kavanaugh was nominated. A lot of the rules were sort of skirted for that confirmation to be as swift as it was. And then sort of the coup d'etat was when Amy Coney Barrett was nominated right after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in 2020, just a few days before the end of the 2020 election, and notably after like 60 million Americans had already voted. The Republicans have been aggressive at doing this. They've broken the rules for Supreme Court justice confirmations, but also for lower court judge confirmations. So I'll mention that for the last 2 years of Obama's presidency, Republicans in the United States Senate held open 17 Court of Appeals seats and 88 district court seats. And by comparison, President Biden, when he came into office, inherited only 2 circuit court seats and 43 district court seats. The way the Republicans did this was by, breaking a lot of the rules, including their own from 2016 about confirming a Supreme Court justice during an election year. But they also got rid of some of the conventions that senators had grown accustomed to. For instance, there's a blue slip convention where home state senators usually get some say in judicial nominees from their states. And, the Republicans in the Senate over the past 6 years have kind of done away with that. They added more circuit court nominees to the hearings. They even held hearings during Senate recess in order to process more nominees. And what is kind of remarkable is that they actually confirmed a great number of judges, even during the lame duck session after Trump had lost re-election, which was virtually unprecedented. So all of that to say, they have been incredibly aggressive, and I think they are now worried because they see their project being threatened by a growing movement among progressives to rebalance the courts. And if we're being aggressive, it's only because that's what it's going to take to counter their aggressiveness.
So there are groups out there that think justice-minded organizations like yours and like ours are overreacting and that there's actually nothing really wrong with the Supreme Court. They just call balls and strikes, right? And that we just don't like the decisions that are being handed down. So what do you say in response to claims like that?
I mean, I think the first thing I'll say is that, part of the reason the Supreme Court has the power it does is because the people view it as legitimate. So it's problematic even if this is just the narrative that people believe at this point. But there's also abundant evidence that the Supreme Court is not just calling balls and strikes. And it's only people who've worked for decades to accomplish this supermajority on the court that actually believe that. So you look at the Supreme Court approval numbers, they're at an all-time low. There are dozens of examples how the Supreme Court's not just calling balls and strikes, and it is those examples that result in a Supreme Court that has such low approval ratings. And I'll just name a couple. I mean, if you look at, for instance, this court is incredibly conservative and incredibly pro-corporate. So since Justice Roberts has been on the court, has been Chief Justice, the Chamber of Commerce has been on the winning side of 70% of the cases in which it has participated. But the court is also constantly, ruling ways that benefit the Republican Party. I think it's especially illuminating to look at voting rights cases, election law cases. If you look at the court's decisions in gerrymandering cases, in cases involving the Voting Rights Act, even in Citizens United cases involving campaign finance reform. These are laws that, after being struck down by the Supreme Court, have overwhelmingly benefited the Republican Party. But you can also look how the justices actually manipulate the way they analyze cases. So I think a great example is this past year. If you look at the 2 big cases from this past year, there was the Bruen case. It was about a New York gun control measure, and the
Right.
Dobbs case, which was, of course, about abortion. In the Bruen case, the justices call themselves originalists, and they look at history to inform how they rule. But in the Bruen case, they looked at this very limited, this very narrow portion of history in order to strike down the New York law at issue. And they did kind of the opposite in Dobbs, where they were sort of freewheeling about the history they looked at, looking from the 13th century on. So from the results down to the analysis, like this court is not just calling balls and strikes. And anyone other than the people who are so deeply invested in how the supermajority rules can see that.
Wow. So Pew Research recently reported that Biden has appointed more judges since JFK at this point in his tenure, and Biden's appointees have been the most diverse in history. Yet there have been reports that this result was not exactly automatic. How have groups like yours and ours and your supporters have been able to influence this outcome?
It has definitely been a group effort, Mark, as you said, like you and I both sit in meetings with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and there are dozens of other organizations that are doing this work. I will give credit where credit is due. President Biden came in with sort of a mandate on this. So even before he took office, his White House legal counsel sent a letter to senators saying, this is the kind of judge I want to see, and I want to see these nominees coming in a timely fashion. So this was clearly a priority from day one, even before day one. But I think, we in the coalition, Demand Justice, Freedom from Religion Foundation, all the other organizations have done a remarkable job of keeping up the heat too. So I've been so excited. I hope it doesn't slow down as we get through the last 6 months of this Congress. But Biden has done a remarkable job of bringing some more balance. We are so excited about the number of public defenders that have gotten onto the bench, the number of civil rights lawyers, people who have experience representing everyday Americans as opposed to, people who have experience prosecuting crimes or representing corporations. That is where the vast majority of experience has come before Biden's administration. So we view this as a really, really great development.
And also Justice Jackson, of course, President Biden got to nominate her, and that was an incredibly historic nomination. But I want to ask you, there's a generation of Americans who remember a time when Supreme Court nominees got overwhelming support in the Senate. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for example, was confirmed 96-3 in the Senate in 1993. And if you contrast that to Justice Barrett, who was confirmed 52-48, it seems that times have definitely changed. So is there any legitimacy to the claim that the Supreme Court is now a partisan institution? And if you agree with that, how do we restore its independence? Yeah,
so I share the frustration and disappointment at how politicized the process has become. We are definitely at a point now that we're unlikely to see any confirmations of lower court judges, much less Supreme Court justices, unless the White House and the Senate are under control of the same party. And that's a sad place for us to be. And I think the explanation for these narrower and narrower confirmation margins is likely just that it is the inevitable result of increasing polarization more broadly in our country. We've gotten to a point where the goal of each major political party is often simply to stop the successes of the other party. But I think in terms of outcomes, Republicans have understood for decades that they are a minority party. They consistently represent a numerical minority of the American public, as we see with, gerrymandering in the House, the sort of structural disadvantage of the Senate and the Electoral College. But the Republican Party also advocates for a lot of policies that are increasingly unpopular. And the two biggest examples right now are, abortion bans are very unpopular. And on the flip side, gun violence prevention measures are very popular. And the Republican Party is sort of on the wrong side of both of those issues. And the reason I bring this up is because I as I see it, the reason the Republican Party has had this project of making the courts more conservative is that's the way to impose policies that are too unpopular for the elected branches to impose. So I do see the Supreme Court, and frankly the lower courts too, as having become just a branch of the political reality in this country. I think we're going to get to some more details about reform later on in the show, but I will just say that there are some really great options, really great proposals. And I think what's encouraging for me right now is that we're having the conversation about reforms. Even 3 years ago, we wouldn't have been having these conversations. And so, I think we have a lot of work to do to shore up our democracy. And I think Supreme Court reform has to be part of that.
I agree with you that I think in the last 3 years, a lot more people are talking about the courts. People have become really educated in what our federal courts do, and especially what's happening at the U.S. Supreme Court. So I just want to ask you, what was your moment? When did you realize that the Supreme Court is broken?
I think it's been sort of a 10-year process, but I think when I first started realizing it was in 2013. At the time, I was doing voting rights. I litigated voting rights cases, and that was what I did for the first 13 years of my career. And in one fell swoop, the Supreme Court came in and ruled in Shelby County versus Holder to strike down sort of the main pillar of the Voting Rights Act. And if you look just a little bit deeper, you can read all about, how John Roberts had just joined the court as the Chief Justice and had made it his life's work to undo the Voting Rights Act. He started his career in 1982 in the Reagan Department of Justice, writing memo after memo after memo about how to weaken the Voting Rights Act. And so, I think it was Congress presented tens of thousands of pages of evidence about why the Voting Rights Act was still necessary. And this singular person who had made it his life's mission to get rid of this law came in and did it. And that was indicative to me of a court that had really gone off the rails and was no longer operating as a court.
Yeah, and I think that was a big wake-up call for me as well, that when you saw that, and again, the Voting Rights Act a few years before under Republican control was renewed by Congress under huge majorities, and then the Supreme Court goes, we have a different opinion. And I think that certainly crystallized a lot of my thinking about where the Supreme Court sees itself, what it sees to be doing, and what it sees its role in society as, and how it can really override the decisions of the executive and the legislature without much concern for what's happening around it.
So just a reminder to our viewers, if you have questions for Katie O'Connor, the Deputy Chief Counsel for Demand Justice, you can ask them in the Facebook comments below or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Be sure also to answer today's question. What do you think FFRF and Demand Justice should be doing together to reform our courts? One of the positions Demand Justice has is to expand the Supreme Court. This has been somewhat a controversial position. Why do you think it's necessary?
I think expanding the Supreme Court is necessary just because of the urgency of the threats that are posed by the Supreme Court. I know that most people want to get to a point where our democracy is more stable and our Supreme Court is more stable and we're operating on a sustainable level in terms of how we move forward. But the immediate concern is what the Supreme Court is doing to our rights and to our ability to make progress. And obviously we see that, in this recent term with the gun violence prevention case, the abortion case, the two religion cases that just blew the wall between church and state wide open. This is a court that's going full speed ahead, and adding seats is the only thing that addresses that very immediate need to slow down the dismantling of our rights and of acts through the legislative process that are very popular among the American people. And I will say, the court has indicated that it's also not slowing down. I mean, this term was a blockbuster term, but there's plenty of evidence that they're going to keep going as fast as they can, as long as they can. So, there's a piece of legislation, the Judiciary Act of 2021, which would add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. We would immediately be able to sort of bring more balance back to the Supreme Court. And I think once that immediate problem is addressed, then we could talk about how to make the court more sustainable, how to make the process smoother and fairer.
So what do you say to the people who say, well, if we expand the Supreme Court now because we're under, the House and the Senate, and the Senate is controlled by the Democrats, the Republicans are just going to come in and do the same when they regain control. So what do you say to that? And do you think that this is a healthy thing for our democracy?
Yeah, so to that argument, I think first and foremost, it's a risk we have to take. I believe that this court is posing very, very serious threats. And perhaps the most daunting one this coming term is the voting rights case that the Supreme Court is going to hear, which could ultimately give sort of unlimited powers to state legislatures to determine the ways that their electoral votes are allocated. And had that sort of legal theory been in place 2 years ago, Donald Trump could easily have been successful at stealing the election. I think that's the most urgent of concerns for our country. And so I don't think we have the luxury of taking risk-free actions right now. But I will also respond to sort of the substance of the concern. And, my honest opinion there is that we're already sort of in a judicial arms race. I strongly believe, and I think there's abundant evidence to show, that Republicans would do this in a heartbeat at the very moment that it benefited them, and not one moment later. So we're already sort of like racing to the bottom to some extent. The only way to sort of stop that downward spiral is to bring both sides to the negotiating table and come up with some terms that everyone's willing to stand by. And playing hardball is likely the only way to actually bring the Republican Party to the negotiating table the way we need to. In short, the Republican Party is never going to voluntarily give up the Supreme Court supermajority that it worked decades to build, unless it believes that giving up that supermajority is the only way to avoid an even worse outcome for them.
Yeah, I think what you said makes a lot of sense, is that that folks aren't going to stop until their power on the Supreme Court has been checked, which necessitates the need for this type of legislation. And then as an organization, you've helped to increase support for court expansion. And that idea has grown in popularity. As we talked about 3 years ago, this conversation probably wouldn't be happening. So what strategies and tactics has Demand Justice deployed that has moved public opinion the most?
We've put a lot of effort into primarily just getting in touch with voters, getting in touch with everyday people who are thinking about all the various issues that impact them and their families and their lives, and convincing them, persuading them that the courts are as important as anything else to those issues. So, we have the luxury of working on the courts day in and day out, and there are tons of people out there working on, the issues that you all support, the separation of church and state. There are plenty of people who are looking to protect abortion rights or contraceptive rights, LGBTQ rights, gun violence prevention, immigrant rights. The list goes on and on and on. And what we've been trying to educate people about is that the courts impact all of this. And to a large extent, all of these issues come down to the courts. And so a vast majority of our efforts have been just building sort of grassroots support for, I should say, the first part is educating the grassroots on the need for court reform, and then building support for that court reform. So we've been really successful in getting people to do virtual constituent meetings with their members of Congress. I think, lawmakers are swayed more than, nothing sways a lawmaker like hearing from a constituent that this particular bill is particularly important to me. And so a lot of our efforts have been directed towards building that kind of grassroots support.
So in July, rumors started swirling around Washington that Biden made a deal with McConnell to appoint Chad Meredith, a conservative lawyer who's represented anti-abortion causes, to a lifetime seat in the Eastern District of Kentucky. So what is your understanding? Why did Biden want to make this deal, and how did you oppose this deal?
Yeah, so it is somewhat unclear what Biden would actually have gotten out of this deal. A lot of the articles actually said that he was making this deal for 2 United States attorneys. This was so disappointing, just because you would never have seen, President Trump or then Majority Leader McConnell agree to a lawyer who had frequently argued for abortion rights or against gun rights. If there were ever deals made, and the deals were made pretty sparingly, they were instead for fairly moderate, non-ideological judges who happened to identify as Democrats. And so the idea that on the cusp of Roe versus Wade being overturned, you would nominate someone who had dedicated much of his professional career to fighting against abortion rights was really disappointing and really disheartening. And I'm very glad that the deal fell through. I will add, it was especially disappointing given the rumors that it was for 2 United States attorneys, because federal judges serve for life and U.S. attorneys are appointed by the president. So this would have even been not even someone who would have, sat in that position for life. So it was really disappointing. We're very glad it fell through. We ran a digital ad campaign that was targeted at Joe Biden. We partnered with an organization called Ultraviolet on this. Just saying no, you can't do this, not in this climate, not given everything that's happened to the judiciary over the past 10 years. But, the lead was really taken by reproductive rights, reproductive justice, and gender justice organizations. They expressed their concern publicly, but I also understand that they did a lot of behind the scenes work to express their concern to the White House and to senators directly. And I'll just reiterate that we're so lucky to work in partnership with those organizations, with organizations like yours. Every step of this work for the past 2 years has been a group effort, and it wouldn't have been successful had it not been.
Well, a lot of times progressive groups feel pressure not to be critical about actions that a Democratic administration might take. Did you feel any of that pressure not to take a critical stand against the Biden administration?
Yes, of course, we did. And I will just say, I think it's a constant give and take. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's sort of like sticks or carrots. And sometimes we were more willing to wield sticks than other organizations. That being said, our organization went out of its way, and I went out of my way to give credit where credit was due. Like I said when I was talking about Biden's, remarkable success at filling so many judicial vacancies and with so many great people. We've tried to be sort of even-handed, and so. Yes, when there's something that we think is problematic that, our usual allies are doing, we think it's our job to call them out on that. But we've also tried to stand up every time we can and thank people and recognize the hard work that senators in the White House are doing. I should say also members of the U.S. House are doing on this issue. So. We're a little bit more willing to wield the stick, but we've tried to wield the carrots too.
Yeah, I think that's why our organizations are very similar. So again, FFRF is a 501c3 organization, and we're bound by our tax laws to be nonpartisan. But Demand Justice is not structured that way. Demand Justice is comprised of a 501c3, a 501c4, and a PAC. Our viewers may not actually know the differences between those 3 entities, so could you explain why Demand Justice made that strategic strategic decision to organize itself in that manner?
Yeah, so we started out 4.5 years ago. And initially we had a 501c3 and a 501c4. So 501c3s typically are like educational organizations. They do some advocacy work, but it's largely educating the public on the issues that matter to the organizations. We started out as a 501c3 and a 501c4 because 501c4 allows you to do a little bit more lobbying and other advocacy that is occasionally partisan or political. And we needed that sort of flexibility given what our plans were initially. Our PAC is relatively new. So we started in 2020 encouraging the candidates for the Democratic nomination to the presidency to talk about Supreme Court reform. By early 2020, it was clear that the Supreme Court was broken, and we wanted people who were coming into office to have plans for how to fix it. And so we started, having our volunteers show up and ask candidates about their plans for Supreme Court reform. And our PAC kind of grew out of that. It felt like a natural next step to be able to formally support candidates who support the kinds of reform that we would like to see. And so we were excited this year to make our first endorsements under the PAC, and we look forward to how it goes moving forward.
So with your endorsements, you've endorsed 7 congressional candidates, which, as you said, is a first. And can you talk a little bit more about why these 7 candidates, and why did you feel it was critical to start endorsing candidates?
Yeah, I think for us, it was just about getting to candidates earlier in the process so that by the time they take office, they are already primed to be thinking about the issues that we care about, and potentially to even have expressed support for the legislation that we care about. So the legislation that is sort of fundamental to our work is the Judiciary Act of 2021, which would add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. All of the candidates that we've endorsed this year are candidates who've expressed support for that legislation. So it's just about every Congress you have 2 years, and when you're campaigning for Congress, it feels like 2 years. That's tons of time. Mm-hmm. But you and I know it just goes by so fast. So the sooner you can get people interested in the issues and supportive of the issues that you care about, the better. And I think that's why we decided to have a PAC and to endorse candidates, because it was a way to start having influence prior to the actual election.
How is demand justice going to be active in 2022 for the elections?
So I think aside from our endorsements, we will continue to promote the candidacies of the people that we've endorsed. But I think more broadly, we were really supportive of members of Congress who aren't going to shy away from the really bold solutions that we need at this sort of perilous moment for our democracy. Something that I was thinking of a few minutes ago when you asked whether expanding the Supreme Court is dangerous for our democracy. I think no. I think our democracy is hurting right now, and there is an understanding sort of across the progressive movement that democracy reform needs to be a priority for all of the issues that we care about, for freedom from religion, separation of church and state, for abortion rights, for LGBTQ rights. Democracy reform has to be, part and parcel with all of those other issues that need shoring up. And we want to make sure that there is an understanding that court reform is an essential part of democracy reform. Specifically because all of the legislation that we would need to, for instance, shore up abortion rights or gun violence prevention, all of that legislation is at risk in front of the Supreme Court. So we don't think our issue is, particularly different from any of these others or needs a higher priority. We just think it needs the same priority because it is an essential piece of the democracy reform platform.
So I want to talk about some of these broader reform efforts. So in June, Demand Justice released a poll that said 61% of all Americans think that Justice Clarence Thomas should be investigated given his failure to recuse himself from some of the cases that were related to the 2020 election. In our work here at FFRF, many of our members were appalled to hear Justice Alito's recent speech in Rome about the Dobbs decision, and were asking to call for his recusal when religious liberty cases come before the Supreme Court in the future. So what are your thoughts on those, and what do you think should be done to clean up ethics at the Supreme Court level?
Yeah, so I think, fortunately, this is actually an issue that should and could be bipartisan. The Supreme Court is currently not bound by any code of ethics, which is remarkable if you think about it. Every other federal judge in the country is bound by a code of ethics, and the Supreme Court is not. So the Supreme Court definitely needs a binding code of ethics. But there are also other issues that really need to be shored up. So, there is a law that requires Supreme Court justices to recuse if there is a conflict of interest or if there is even an appearance of impartiality. There is no enforcement mechanism for those recusal standards. So there are a number of really great pieces of legislation that have been introduced in both the House and the Senate that would address both of these issues, that would impose a binding code of ethics on Supreme Court justices, and that would provide for an enforcement mechanism for recusal, as well as sort of a review process for justices' decisions on whether or not to recuse. I'll just mention a couple of the bills. There's the 21st Century Courts Act, which was introduced by Senator Whitehouse and Representative Johnson, the Judicial Ethics and Anti-Corruption Act, which was introduced by Senator Warren and Representative Jayapal, and the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act by Representative Nadler and Senator Whitehouse. What we saw from Alito and Thomas, Alito making statements that clearly produce an appearance of impartiality when it comes to issues of freedom of exercise and, freedom from religion. And then with Thomas, there's so many ethics issues with Thomas, but, the most notable one is just his failure to recuse or even explain his failure to recuse from cases involving the 2020 election, when it turns out that his wife was very deeply involved in efforts to overturn that election. So that's the bad news, that there's no way to sort of get these people right now other than impeachment. The only way to hold justices accountable is to impeach them. The good news is that there are several pieces of legislation, and I think in normal times this legislation would be popular on a bipartisan basis. In fact, the House Judiciary Committee held a hearing a couple of months ago where, a lot of the Republican members all but admitted that the only reason they were opposed to this legislation is because the timing indicated that it was sort of targeted at Justice Thomas. But there is wide and deep understanding that this legislation is necessary. And so I do hope that there will come a time in the not too distant future where we can all agree that Supreme Court justices should be, held to some transparency and accountability measures like everybody else.
Yeah, and I think the big takeaway from this is that the Supreme Court's not untouchable. All of our institutions, all of our democratic institutions are subject to checks and balances, and these legislative proposals can change the Supreme Court, and it's been done before. And I think that's what our audience needs to know and people need to become engaged with. So we do have several questions from the audience if we're ready for those. So Kara asks, how can we work at the local level to monitor judge appointments and elections?
So with judicial appointments, those, for the most part, senators from the states make recommendations to the president for federal judicial nominations. And so it helps for senators to hear from you about what you want and don't want in the judicial nominees that come out of your state. And that has certainly been, that has made a difference in the past couple of years. I suspect that there could have been more Chad Merediths and other sort of right-wing judicial nominees had it not been for some pressure from local and state leaders asking the president to nominate good judges. So I do think that there's a real place for grassroots activism there, especially if you have those relationships with your senators. They need to hear from you about how this is a priority and what you expect from their judicial nominee.
Yeah, absolutely. So Lisa asks, how do you feel about term limits at the Supreme Court?
I am fully supportive of term limits, as is my organization. And I think, Mark, you mentioned the Unrig the Courts Coalition.
Right.
For the most part, all of the organizations that support Supreme Court expansion also support Supreme Court term limits. And term limits, like ethics reform for Supreme Court justices, have a history of being, supported on a bipartisan basis. The only caveat I will give is that term limits address a different issue than adding seats to the court. Adding seats to the court addresses the very immediate issue of a court that is just drastically out of step with the American people. Adding 4 seats would sort of shore up the rights that this court is supposed to protect. And so that is why adding seats is so urgent, because the Supreme Court is so out of control. Term limits address a different issue. They address the issue of a process that is out of control. And so I think they go hand in hand. I would very much like to see term limits implemented so that every judicial vacancy on the Supreme Court is not an all-out war between the parties, so that we can operate with a 9-justice court, in a way that we might not be able to if we don't fix the confirmation process. So fully support term limits, but I also fully believe that adding seats has to come first in order to address the very immediate risk.
So the next question, Olivia asks, what would be the process of impeaching a justice, and has it happened before?
So it's the same process as impeaching a president. It has happened, but it was like 150 years ago. It's a steep climb. You have to show that there are high crimes and misdemeanors, some impeachable offense. You have to have have the House do the impeachment proceedings and then the Senate do the trial, and that it takes a pretty significant majority. It's not completely unprecedented, but especially given the polarization in both chambers of Congress, it's exceedingly unlikely to be successful, unfortunately, which is not to say we shouldn't investigate the issue. I do think that there's value in exposing to the American public when Supreme Court justices are acting unethically, even if it doesn't lead to immediate ramifications.
So George asks, how will Americans react to the credibility of the Supreme Court due to this year's polarized decisions?
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen the response in a lot of polls. I mean, I take polling data for what you will, but I think it's consistent enough at this point that we can pretty safely say that approval of the Supreme Court and faith in the Supreme Court has plummeted in the past 2.5 years, certainly, but in the past year, pretty significantly too. So it's a serious legitimacy crisis that this court faces, and one that is going to have to lead to reform in one way or another.
And so there are questions from a woman named Karen, and I think they're the same. So I'm going to read all of them because I think they all go together as well. So she asks, who has the power to reform the courts? It seems as though the Supreme Court currently has more power than Congress or the president. And then related to that, if Republicans win in the midterms in 2022, there will be no power to do anything about the courts. So what, if anything, can be done before then?
So it depends on the reform we're talking about. As I said, the reform that I view as most urgent is adding 4 seats to the Supreme Court. And for that that particular reform, all it takes is an act of Congress. So there's a piece of legislation that's already been introduced. It would just have to be passed by the House, passed by the Senate, and signed by the president. Of course, we know how deadlocked the Congress is, and so take that for what it's worth. But I strongly believe that at some point the dam will break and Democrats will realize that they have to start doing the legislating that they were elected to do. And I hope that Supreme Court reform, along with voting rights reform, along with campaign finance reform, is part of the broader reform package that comes out when that dam breaks. Some of the other reforms are trickier. Well, I should say the Supreme Court ethics reforms are also just acts of Congress. They would be subject to challenges in the Supreme Court, but I think they would be on pretty stable grounds. The trickier reform is term limits, because it is a constitutional provision that gives Supreme Court justices life tenure. So there are arguments on both sides about whether you would need a constitutional amendment to implement term limits, and I think that question is still very much unanswered, but it does require a little bit more study than the other reforms that we're considering. And the last thing I'll say is, while Congress is sort of stalemated on every issue, the one thing that they've been doing very well is confirming Biden's judicial nominees, who, as I've mentioned, are just a remarkable group of nominees who have represented a lot of issues that we care about, a lot of everyday Americans. There have been a lot of public defenders, legal aid lawyers, people who are labor lawyers and plaintiffs' attorneys, and just have experience that is so needed on the federal bench. And so what we can do without Congress passing legislation is to make sure that even before the midterms, this Congress confirms as many of those judges as possible.
So there's just two more questions, and one of them I think you already answered. It was just who makes the decision to add seats. Is it the president? Is it Congress? And then the last question is from Jeffrey, who says, how will the Supreme Court's decisions affect the upcoming elections, specifically the 2024 presidential election? So what does Demand Justice think about that?
So I feel like that's a two-part question. I think there's evidence that some of the Supreme Court's more unpopular decisions, like the decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, or the decision to strike down, a lot of the country's gun violence prevention measures, I think those are decisions that most Americans disagree with, and they are likely to have an impact on the results of the election this year and potentially in 2024. I think the other piece to that is how the Supreme Court could limit voting rights over the next 2 years and potentially open the door for another coup attempt by a potential, 2024 candidacy of Donald Trump or someone like him. So I am really worried about the Supreme Court's decision this year to hear a case about what's called the independent state legislature theory, which, as I alluded to earlier, would simply allow state legislatures to kind of do whatever they want without limits to allocate their electors for the Electoral College. And should that be in place when you have a president who wants to steal, when you have a candidate who wants to steal a legitimately run election, that could change the course of history. So they could impact elections a lot. Let's just hope that the Supreme Court sees this independent state legislature theory for sort of the farce that it is. There is a vast and wide understanding that this is not a valid legal argument, and so let's just hope that the Supreme Court sees it with that clarity too.
Well, thank you so much. That concludes Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you so much for joining with us, Katie. We're always honored to be working with you and with Demand Justice. We appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thank you both so much.
All right. And also this week on Free Thought Radio, FFRF's weekly radio show and podcast at ffrf.org/radio. And Annie, Lori, and Dan are speaking with Philip S. Gorski, author of the new book, The Flag and the Cross. If you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. And if you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us. See you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.